Okay, we shall start now. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Lara Malab. I'm the Director of Business Development and Marketing at Rack Icc. Our topic for today is about UAE Rack Icc foundations from international and local aspects. We have a great sign up for this webinar. And I'm very delighted to welcome our panel of speakers from Diana Hamadi, Attorneys at Law and Esquire Group. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and shall be shared with you later following the webinar, along with the presentation slides. We will also post it on our website for those who are unable to attend. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box or in the question box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up in the, during the Q&A session at the end. And in case we're running out of time, we will address your questions individually following the webinar. Our speakers for today: Dr. Samir Al-Ansari is a UK qualified chartered accountant with over 30 years of senior corporate operational private equity investing board and strategic advisory experience. Dr. Al-Ansari sits on a number of boards, including Rak Icc, TBM, Healthcare Partners, Rams Capital, and Eureka Capital. He has served on numerous regional and international boards, such as the DIFC from 2004 to 2016, Hawkama, the Industrial Group, KSA, Dubai Holding, DIC, etc. He's also a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, and a member of the Institute's advisory board for MENA. From Rack Icc as well, we have Alan Bugord, our registrar. Alan has over 20 years experience working in the financial services industry. Before he joined Rack Icc in 2014, he was the registrar of companies and the registrar of intellectual property of Guernsey Registry. He has held previous positions as managing director of Skepton International and was the former chairman of the Association of Guernsey Banks and former deputy chairman of the Guernsey International Business Association. Both Dr. Samir and Alan will give us a brief introduction of Rack Icc and then tell us more about the Rack Icc foundations. We also have joining us as a speaker, Diana Hamadi. Diana is a UAE lawyer and founder of Diana Hamadi Attorneys at Law, focusing on high-end cross-border litigation in family businesses and succession planning. She's licensed by the Ministry of Justice, the Dubai Legal Affairs Department, the Abu Dhabi Judicial Department. She's also registered wills draftsman with the DIFC Wills Service Center. Diana is also known practitioner in succession planning, advising on foundations, trusts, and Waqf, and providing practical guidance on structures for estate and succession planning under Sharia, Dubai DIFC, ADGM, and UAE laws. Diana will give us tell us more about the rise of the UAE foundations, covering the benefits of foundations for both individuals and businesses. We also have Jimmy Sexton, who's the founder and CEO of Esquire Group, a boutique international tax consulting firm. Esquire Group has been serving clients globally since 2005. For almost 2 decades, Jimmy has been advising clients throughout the world on international tax matters. Widely recognized as an expert in international taxation, he often speaks throughout the world at such organizations as the UN, eBay, and the American Chamber of Commerce, and is regularly quoted and published by such media outlets as CNN, the Washington, D.C., and Forbes. Based in Dubai, Jimmy serves clients across the Middle East, Europe, and USA. Jimmy will tell us more about the estate and succession planning, along with other considerations for expats, UAE expats returning to their home countries. Now, without further ado, I will turn the time over to Dr. Samir. Dr. Samir, you're on mute. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara, and welcome everyone. I see we've got well over 100, I think almost 200 participants on our webinar today. Many thanks, Lara, for the introduction, and a warm welcome to Diana and Jimmy joining us for the webinar today, and all of you who have made the time to join us. This webinar really was put together by popular demand because we have received tremendous interest in the foundations regime of Rack Icc. Rack Icc only launched the foundations regime in about a year ago, just a little bit more than a year ago. And during this period, we've done more than 30, almost 40 foundations. To put that in perspective, last year that was more than the ADGM and a little bit less than the IFC. So clearly a very popular structuring product, and one that I have to thank Lara for, because she really was the one who pushed for us to introduce foundations, which initially I was pretty hesitant about, but has proved to be extremely popular. And I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think because of the features and advantages of foundations, and I think the advantages over trusts will only continue to grow in popularity and use. I know the webinar today is about foundations, so I'm only going to do a very, very brief introduction on Rack Icc. I think most of you who are attending today or participating today know a lot about Rack Icc. So very, very, very few slides. I think you all know that we are based in the UAE. We're a registry that's owned by the government. And what I'm delighted to share with you is that we are one of the very few registries that incorporate offshore companies globally that is actually growing. And that's a big testament to, I think, a great job that the team is doing, but also to the great things that are happening in the UAE. We all know what a great jurisdiction the UAE is, and we all know the big advantages that the UAE offers over other jurisdictions. But the clear thing is that there is a shift away from pure offshore jurisdictions to more midshore jurisdictions. There is a shift that's based on reputation. There's a shift that's based on being in jurisdictions that are whitelisted. There's a shift because companies need to be in jurisdictions that can meet economic substance requirements and so on. And so we are actually very lucky to be in the UAE and to have a registry that offers you the ability to create the structures that Rack Icc can offer in such a jurisdiction. We can move to the next slide, and in fact, we can move to the one after. The UAE turns 50 this year. So this is not a new country that is unproven. The UAE is a world-class jurisdiction with mature banking and legal system. It's a real economy with the GDP per capita of over $40,000. It's always ranked as one of the top in the ease of doing business. But I think one of the key items to highlight is really the great journey that the UAE has been on in the last few years on the regulatory and compliance front. And that is what is positioning the UAE in a very unique and great position going forward. And it's actually helping registries like us because we are world-class. We want to be seen as world-class. We want to be globally compliant. And that is what is attracting the right type of clients who want to operate in an environment that will give them certainty for the long term and will also not create issues for them within their structures. We know about abundant ecosystem of professionals, experts, and so on. This is a real economy where people can structure things for the long term, where they can meet economic substance requirements where they need it, and so on. But all of that in an environment where there is no taxation. and where there is no restriction on capital and profit repatriation. The UAE has one of the longest lists of double taxation treaties, and therefore you have the possibility to take advantage of that. Add to this the advantage of having access to a registry in the UAE and also the low cost of doing business in Ras Al Khaimah. And then you put all that together, and I always say it is a no-brainer that you would want to structure your business, your inheritance structures, long-term structures, etc., foundations in the UAE, and always with cost in mind in Ras Al Khaimah. Well, when the world is open for traveling again, the world is only a few hours away, and we are very lucky again to be, frankly, based in the middle of the world. But the time will come when this advantage will continue to be a huge advantage. And because of all the things that I've talked about, and all the things that I mentioned, and our location, and our accessibility, and so on, Rack Icc has been very popular and has accumulated over 30,000 companies from almost every country around the world, 160 countries. If you look at that pie chart, 5 of the top 10 countries are European, with the UK being #1, then France, Italy, Germany, Russia, and so on. So this is a very popular jurisdiction for Europeans, for this region, India, UAE, and increasingly so, by the way, from the Far East, as people realize the advantages that the UAE offers over some of the more traditional offshore centers that are, either already blacklisted or on a watch list, cannot meet economic substance requirements, etc., etc. So there are many, many advantages to operating within the UAE and using Rack Icc structures. We've achieved that through a fantastic network of diverse registered agent network, corporate service providers, a mix of global corporate service providers like the Vistra, Trident, Sovereign, Interest Trusts, and SFMs of this world, the international audit firms, the Big 4, Big 5, Big 10, the international law firms, and supported by a mix of smaller, more boutique, local and homegrown organizations. At the core of all of this is the use of these structures, and often Rack Icc companies are used by other private individuals for private wealth planning or by businesses who have created these structures with tax planning in mind, with inheritance in mind, with confidentiality in mind, so on and so forth. All done legally and fully compliant. So whether it's international tax planning or holding companies for succession planning, for financing, or whether it's on the trade side, holding companies, SPVs, and so on, Rack Icc structures continue to be more and more popular. And what I've personally discovered over the last couple of years is that as more of the lawyers and the tax advisors have understood the Rack Icc laws and regulations and features, the more they are beginning to use Rack Icc structures. Very often I get the response, oh, we didn't know you could do that with a Rack Icc company. So why Rack Icc? And many of these things you know already. So 100% foreign ownership, one-day incorporation, no restriction on number of shareholders, corporate directors are permitted, no office requirements unless you are within the economic substance requirements and you need to have substance in the jurisdiction, no attestation required for corporate documents, cost-effective registration and renewal fees, no requirement to file financial accounts, again, no requirements for minimum capital, etc., etc. So many corporate features that make it quite easy and very useful to use those Rack Icc structures. But it's the legal structures that are often overlooked. People don't know that you can apply common law regulations to our companies and access to the DIFC and ADGM courts with a variety of legal structures, different types of products. The ability to migrate from other jurisdictions. We have seen a huge number of redomiciliations happening over the last 18 months from many jurisdictions around the world, from the BVIs and the Panamas and the Mauritiuses and Seychelles, all the way to the Lebuans and other jurisdictions, and Samoa and so on. One very important one that's often overlooked, the fact that we have different classes of shares and the fact that you can register share pledges and so on. Very important features for many types of products that are structures that are often overlooked. And of course, very importantly, you operate legally in a jurisdiction that has zero corporate tax, income tax, tax on dividends, royalties, etc., and has access to one of the longest, if not the biggest, range of double taxation treaties. So all these are very, very important features that have made Rack Icc extremely popular. Now with that, I am happy to hand over to Alan to talk you through the Rack Icc Foundation's regime.
Thank you, Dr. Samir.
Samir, if I can add my welcome to everybody. I'll keep this brief because you're more interested in hearing what Diana and Jimmy have to say, and I'm very pleased to be joined by them today. The main point I wanted to make is the approach when you're looking at how to register a foundation is very similar to a company. And if you haven't registered a foundation with us before, but you're used to registering companies here, you really won't find the process too much difficult. I would encourage you to always take the legal advice and the tax advice on establishing a foundation, just to make sure that it is the right product for your client and your client's needs. When we say it's similar to a company, obviously there are different personnel involved. So rather than shareholders, you have a founder who establishes, puts the assets into the foundation. Rather than a board of director, it's run by a council of members. And obviously to be a council, it needs to have a minimum of 2 people. You can't be a council of 1. So that's a slight change from company. And then the foundation can elect to have a guardian who's a protector really and has responsibility for looking to ensure that the foundation is being run in accordance with its rules. And then you'll hear much more from Diana and from Jimmy on the types of foundation and what they can be used for. But as Dr. Samir said, a minimum initial capital, so easy to set up, not expensive to set up, well governed, and that is the thing that people like a foundation, possibly more so than a trust, because the founder can control better the governance of the establishment. And then we respect your right to confidentiality. So we do meet the international standards for disclosure, but in a way that meets your requirement for privacy in the appropriate circumstances. Foundations can move into Rack Icc from other jurisdictions. So if you already have a long established foundation, but because of all the reasons Samir said, in terms of why you would want to establish in the UAE, it's possible to move it over. And of course, a foundation needs to keep good financial records. It needs to have accounting records. It needs to understand its financial position, but those are not publicly available. We've already talked about those advantages for Rack Icc, which extends to foundations as well as to companies. We thought it'd be useful for you to see the comparison between foundations and trusts, and we're not saying that trusts aren't appropriate. In some circumstances they are, and of course trusts can own Rack Icc companies. So Rack Icc has a role in trust planning too. But in many situations, and particularly in the Middle East, we found the foundation has more appeal. We thought you'd be interested to see where the assets that a Rack Icc foundation are being held. And you can see that it is a mix of UAE assets, but also the assets in a number of countries around the world. And the international appeal of foundations has been widely split as well, and in some respects mirrors the international appeal of a Rack Icc company. Truly international, but we also see a big niche in the UAE market too. And what are they being used for? So obviously asset holding, you won't be at all surprised by that. I know Diana will talk more about succession planning. Jimmy will talk about the tax planning. They can be, we've often seen foundations owning Rack Icc companies and foundations owning companies that own property in the UAE and elsewhere. Charitable use for foundations we've seen, and we're pleased to support that. Just one word on that: if you are looking to hold a foundation that has a charitable purpose in the UAE, of course, very important that you meet the UAE charity rules and regulations. So don't feel you can simply set up a Rack Icc charitable foundation and that it will enable you to operate. Of course, it operates within the context of the local laws. And a massive market for the protection of family assets. Of course, we see that as being increasingly important as things go forward.
Thank you, Alan. Now, Diana, over to you, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with the team of Rack Icc, speaking about foundations in the UAE. Like many lawyers in this jurisdiction, I am groomed in a civil law jurisdiction. So foundations has happened to be part of our jurisdiction. Later, we were introduced to the common law products, structures. So somehow we feel like foundation is like more, we're keen on foundations more than other structures, but that is quite a personal thing. When you hear the word foundation as a common man, as just a normal person who is looking into a structure, a business model, you would find these terms coming back and back all the time, being repeated: independent, separate, orphan. It may sound quite weird to many people. Why would we use this continuously with the foundation? But this is what, in a way, separates a foundation from the other two structures that are mainly supposed to be similar, which is a trust and a company. The foundation main characteristic is that it is not a trust and not a company, but it is both in one. And that's where the advantage of the foundation actually is based on and comes from. So when you think of a foundation, think of a company that has a legal entity to operate, to actually represent itself in lawsuits, to get into dealings, to enter into transactions. How, at the same time, it has what the trust has of certain features. So we will talk later about what are the advantages of a foundation, but I thought this would be sufficient to start with the first slide. We can go to the next slide, Lara. I know many of us would come across family foundation, private foundations. What are these foundations? So when we spoke about the foundation earlier, we have a foundation that is mainly set up for a certain purpose. And the purposes usually with normal foundations, with the foundations that we look for with our clients to set up, are wealth structuring, asset protection, long-term holding structure of business, specific purposes of certain commercial transactions, and of course, charity and philanthropic purposes. But when we see what a private foundation and a family foundation here, there comes a need to know what are these, because many foundations and most of the foundations that we see worldwide have been set up for the family business purpose. And that's where family foundations come as a big part of the foundations worldwide. The family foundation usually is one whose funds are derived from members of a single family. Though this is not a legal term, so the family foundation, you wouldn't see it as a legal term when you are structuring a foundation, but it comes as a definition that we give to certain foundations that are based and mainly purposed for a family. Family foundations make up over half of what we call a private foundation, which is a private foundation could be corporate, independent, and operating. So the family foundation is one of the private foundations, which are corporate, independent, operating, and operating foundations. The word foundation is commonly incorporated into the names of many different types of nonprofits worldwide. So you would immediately relay when you hear the word foundation to the Susan G. Komen Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Make-A-Wish Foundation. But not all of these foundations are necessarily charitable foundations. They are mainly private foundations. A private foundation is a very specific and distinct type of charitable foundation. Because a private foundation stays under the control of the donor, the determination here is that we will have to set the foundation's name, whom to include on the foundation board, where the funds are invested, and how and where funds are given away. So this is a very brief introduction, or just a brief on family foundations and private foundations. So at least when you hear the two terms, you know exactly what people are talking about. Next slide, please. The common structural elements. A foundation is, as we said, is neither a company nor a trust. It's best described as, I said earlier, distinct legal structure, which has been introduced to serve different purposes. Some of the key features of a foundation are the following: private wealth management, mentioned earlier, succession planning. When you hear the word foundation in the UAE, from the very beginning, you would immediately think of succession planning, because the purpose at that time was not necessarily to circumvent Sharia, but mainly to get away from the onshore hassle that we had to go through with many clients. And I personally had a big experience, quite an experience in that. You would see also charitable giving in the foundation. So there are many purposes for these foundations, but the common structural elements are usually, and as Samir mentioned earlier, it's the incorporation, and the incorporation is mainly who can incorporate a foundation, and it's usually the person who requests a foundation. Does that mean the founder has to be an individual? Not necessarily. The founder can be also a corporate founder. So the corporate status, like a company, a foundation exists from the date of its incorporation. Unlike a trust, it has no property at that point to start with at the time of incorporation. Once incorporated, a foundation has unlimited corporate capacity to save that it may not directly be able to have. So it can acquire, hold, or dispose of immovable property wherever it is, and engage in common trading that is not incidental. The other part of the structural elements is the charter. And the charters are mainly what lawyers usually come in with service providers to draft for their clients. The charters have the name of the foundation, the lawful objects of the foundation, information regarding winding up, dissolution, the term of the foundation, and details of the initial endowment, if there is one. That is mainly referred to when it is a charitable foundation. The regulations and bylaws is the other structural element of a foundation. And a foundation may have, if it wishes, and that means that it's not necessarily like a charter, a must-have. Bylaws can be part of the structural elements of a foundation, and they are regulations to the administration of the foundation. I find bylaws usually quite common in families where they have a number of shareholders, and the element of administration of the foundation becomes quite detrimental and crucial. And this is where the bylaws come as a very important part of setting up the foundation. There has to be a founder, and as I said, the founder doesn't have to be an individual only, could be a corporate founder as well. And then there is the council, and as mentioned also earlier, the council is an important, of course, part of the as the graph that we saw earlier. There is the council and finally the guardian. Not every foundation has a guardian, but I have seen lately many foundations that have guardians, and the guardians are being requested to sit on foundations. And sometimes people do ask lawyers to be their guardians on these foundations. Next. So how many foundations we have in the UAE? Okay, I'm going to give you some figures before we start. So we have, of course, as we all know, the ADGM Foundation that was actually introduced in 2017, although I have to say, the DIFC Foundation law was enacted in 2018, but I still remember in 2008, when I joined DIFC at that time and as part of the legal team, we actually had a trust law. So I still remember, like at that point, we were thinking of, should we have a foundation law? And it took DIFC longer than expected to issue to enact its own foundation law. Although it was an idea, it was actually in the history of the DIFC since day one. Should we have a foundation law in addition to the trust law? And I still remember all these discussions we had at that point, that since we are a common law jurisdiction, the foundation should be onshore, and it was a long debate. But I'm glad now to see in 2021, being in the UAE, I see that in 2017, ADGM had its own foundation enacted, 2018 in DRC, and of course, last but not least, 2019, the Rack Icc Foundation, which is a valuable addition to the structures that we have in this country. A lot of people ask me, why, as a lawyer, give us your idea, input on this. Why do you have so many similar things in the UAE? And I always remember the history of the UAE as 7 Emirates getting together. And it was all about being best at what we do. And competition makes best. And I actually are one of those people who really see the outcome of these competitions being for the best of the UAE. So what we have so far as UAE foundations are these 3 foundations. Next. Okay, before I go to the common objectives, I wanted to share with you the figures I have. I'm glad to see and share with you that there are already 250 registered foundations offshore in the UAE. 92 of the foundations are registered in the DIFC, almost 75 registered in ADGM, and amazingly, Rack Icc has almost 50 or more. And it is quite great to see, since the introduction of the enactment of the law of foundations in Rack has been quite recent. So it's heartening to see all of this happening, especially with this data that I just received yesterday. So what are the common objectives of UAE foundations? You're in the UAE and you want to set up a foundation. why would you ever think of a foundation? What would be your objective? The common objectives that we see usually are asset protection, privacy, effective succession planning, improving family governance, enabling philanthropic giving, and establishing a legacy. So, and of course, the foundations are fully digital, quite easy to use. When a client comes to us to set up a foundation, usually through a service provider, and I have to say that the quality of service providers that we have in the UAE in the 3 jurisdictions is quite exceptional. We have brilliant service providers who are well informed, educated. They come from a background that is not at all doubtful. And I'm happy to work with so many of these service providers on the legal aspects. So when these service providers come, the first thing that comes to your mind that a high net worth individual, a high net worth family is supposed to be the client. And it's not the case always. There are people with not necessarily the high net worth or the extra high net worth. There are people who are just concerned about certain issues that come with having any type of wealth or any amount of wealth. And this is where I see the 2 issues, which is the succession planning coming as a purpose, and the privacy. And I have to say that privacy comes also as a very important purpose for many people. And this is what the foundation is characteristically known for. So as we said, okay, so we obviously covered the 2 slides. How do we start a foundation? If we're talking about ADGM foundations, we will talk about some of the advantages. It's a low setup cost, flexibility to amend governance structures once established, redomiciled foundations are a possibility. To use a registered agent is voluntarily. No physical office requirement, no requirement for a founder of a foundation officers to be based in the UAE, which is something that many people are interested in. And people ask questions about whether I have to be a resident of the UAE or not if I'm a founder. And previously, we all knew that ADGM would not have a charitable foundation, but in October 2020, an amendment has been introduced, and ADGM passed its charitable endowment, as they called it, not a charitable foundation, but they called it a charitable endowment in ADGM, and it has the same foundation rules. Next. So how to apply? Of course, there's an application online, and there has to be a registration. Once information accurately submitted, you will a certificate will be completed within a few days. Then application fee of $200. No requirement for a founder or foundations officers to be based in the ADGM, in the UAE, or maintain residency in the UAE. DRC foundations, I can say it's almost the same thing. Typically formed by a founder who commits towards a specific charitable or non-charitable purpose, no interference of foreign laws or heirship rights conferred by any foreign judgment or any foreign court, no recognition, enforcement of foreign judgments, no statutory duration limits, possibility for beneficiaries of transferring payment rights, possibility to migrate foundation in and out of the IFC, and possibility to morph companies into foundations. And of course, there's a possibility for a foundation, foreign to apply for the IFC license, access to private arbitration in case of disputes. And this is where my job as a lawyer comes in, people ask immediately when they're having their charters drafted. So what do we use for dispute resolution? What would you advise? And I'm happy to say that AGGM has its own court. GIFC, there's a private arbitration already part of the foundation structure that you can actually have. And of course, Rack Icc has the option of 2 jurisdictions here, of using AGGM and GIFC courts, which is great because you can have that option and you can exercise on it. The place of registration must be the GIFC. A physical presence is a prerequisite. However, I know for a fact that service providers with their own existence can replace that. Foundation charter is required, and bylaws as the rest are not mandatory. So the register of the foundation should represent. Okay. You saved me. How to apply? If you want to pass that, okay. So let's go to the Rack Foundation and talk a little more about what is a Rack Foundation. As of course, per the earlier 2 presentations, Rack Foundation is a new foundation structure in the UAE, and it has the same structural elements of the foundation that are already available and in a foundation in the UAE and elsewhere. The governing jurisdiction of Rack Icc, as I mentioned, are both courts, either or of DFC or AGGM, which is an added benefit. So let me mention this. In December 2019, Ras Al Khaimah International Corporate Center brought into force the Rack Icc Foundation regulation, and the foundation is a corporate body created by a legal personality separate from that of its founders, as we have said earlier. The following criteria must be fulfilled if you are to incorporate a Rack Icc Foundation. The founder, whether it's an individual or a body corporate, council members. As we said, it cannot be one council member, but it has to be individuals or a body corporate, as well as council members. A registered agent is also has to be fulfilled, a UAE registered office, and a foundation that has a charitable object must appoint a guardian. That comes as part of what is required for a charitable foundation, particularly. So this is the structure that we see, and I don't want to go on again because it has been mentioned by Alain earlier, and it was shown. So this is what you see in the structure, in the foundation structure. And what can the foundation own are, as you may see here, real estate, bank accounts, investment bonds, Rack Icc company, and personal chaplets. So advantages of having a Rack Icc in the UAE. We have these advantages highlighted if you go on the ICC website, platform, internationally compliant registry, robust governance structure, 0% corporate tax rate, comprehensive global network of tax treaties, and Jimmy will talk about that later, which is a quite interesting feature of the UAE. No requirement to file or audit accounts of tax treaties here as well. Possibility to migrate to Rack Icc from overseas, low incorporation and administrative costs, and a swift digital registration process. And I have to say, the digital registration process of Rack Icc is meant to be and actually supposed to be one of the easiest, simplest, and a lot of service providers are finding it so easy to use and user-friendly to a great extent. The additional advantages is confidentiality. This is something that a lawyer would like to talk about. How confidential are foundations? So I'm one of those lawyers who works onshore and offshore. So I know exactly what Dubai courts or Abu Dhabi courts or Sharjah courts would ask for in terms of assets if a case is filed onshore. So the courts would actually specifically send what we call in Arabic ifada, which is like it's an investigation process done, by the court. How much can they see if they are looking for assets onshore, offshore in a foundation? The one thing that I really like about Rack Icc is that the registry is not open for public inspection, which actually saves founders of foundations a lot of the nosy investigations that happen from time to time. And the other thing is, founders' names are quite there in public for public inspection. So there is a way to go around it sometimes by having a corporate founder rather than a personal founder by name. So that also helps, not necessarily, and please do not mark my word, and please don't take my words in any way as if we are trying to hide assets. The idea of a foundation is the confidentiality, not necessarily to defraud. So there is a big difference between having your own confidential foundation and actually having the intention to defraud. Because as lawyers, I would have to say, the common law rules of equity are already embedded in these foundations in what we call the offshores, as well as what we have in the civil law as deterrence from defrauding. So the idea here is we are doing what we're doing to keep it confidential, to keep the assets protected, but the intent to defraud would actually put you at risk of being found by the courts. And these courts are quite strict about their equity rules and laws. And you would need to speak to a lawyer if you have any doubt about these issues. Corporate council members are permitted in Rack Icc, and Rack Icc foundations can be used for charitable purposes and the possibility of migration, continuation, and conversion. So this is the most important bit, and this is where I wanted to highlight it in my presentation. So the confidentiality, as I explained earlier, what it really means. So legally, do not take it as something that you may be able to use at liberty. You have to be very careful when you say confidentiality, and you have to be very careful when you have any intention to deviate from that in any way. Please do speak to lawyers before you do anything. But the public information, as far as Rack Icc is concerned, ADGM is concerned, and the RFC is concerned, I have to say that the Rack Icc, the fact that there's no public registry available is it's a great advantage. Yet, would that deter Rack Icc from providing this information at the request of a court, when the court would ask specifically for certain information? So the public registry that is not available is, of course, a layer of protection. But then again, let's say a court addresses Rack Icc with a request to provide information on a certain thing. This is where the internal work of a service provider with a lawyer can come in quite handy. So this is where you have to think outside a box and do what you need to do. Next, Lara. Am I running out of time, Lara? How long does I still have?
Sorry, we need to rush a bit so we can have more time for the Q&As, because we
yes. Okay.
Questions.
So for an individual who's going for a foundation, most of these individuals want to segregate themselves from their wealth, wish to hold companies anonymously, and this is part of the confidentiality, the tax issues, and sometimes want to transfer wealth to their heirs and according with their own wishes. So this is what individuals use it for. Next. For a business, you will find that important and interesting. There's a lot of governance that comes in these business foundations, set up for foundations, to creating a lasting legacy. I really love that for a lot of the families that come asking for that part of their governance and legacy. Usually they hire family members and reimburse foundation related expenses, and the tax deductible grants and the charitable programs. So why do we need foundations? So now, if anyone knows, I'm gonna take maybe 4 minutes on this, Lara, and I promise I will just close with it. Being the lawyer who works onshore, I have to say that the latest overhaul of the legal system in the UAE that has come with the breaking news in November of having the inheritance of expats being the laws of their own countries, of course, not to forget the cohabitation and all that stuff that came as quite surprising news for everyone. What does that mean for us as far as foundations are concerned? Do we really still need foundations? Have these amendments that have come across so lately and recently? To me, a foundation is still necessary. And why is that? The fact that the succession planning laws are now more available, but that does not mean that they will work like you want them to work for you. The foundation gives you that freedom to do whatever you want within your own structure, which no matter what there is and out there, it will never fulfill the objective that you are seeking from a foundation. This is an area where I work as a specialist. I work on inheritance cases. And I have to say that although the assets in terms of the inheritance law would belong to a foundation after the founder's death, unless otherwise stated in the foundation bylaws, no structure or legal mechanism can prevent a third party from bringing a challenge. So how do you know that this foundation would actually protect you? I know for a fact that a cousin may come from God knows where and maybe file a case onshore for inheritance while you as a founder have had already the foundation for your family, and if you've passed away, your family may be faced with that situation. I have to say that these foundations have proven so far to be protected against this specific case, which a lot of people are asking me now by phone, visiting me in my office saying, if it's going to be my law to be applied, why should I be concerned? But I always say, the law is not only one layer of law. There is public order and there is constitution. So don't fall for what you hear literally. Please do ask lawyers if you are in possession of some wealth in the UAE, you have a family, look at the structures that are available, look at the options that are available, and do not rely on the news that you have listened to lately. With this, I would finish my presentation for the day. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you.
All right, Jimmy, over to you. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right. So I'm Jimmy Sexton. I think you can go on to the next slide. Perfect. So this weekend I was having dinner. I was at a dinner party, and the host asked us all to go around the table and say why we're grateful for living in the UAE. And I think there was about 10 of us. And every single person there was an expat to begin with, and every single person's response had something to do with the UAE being a wealth-friendly country, which, you know, has a lot to do with the fact that there's no income taxes, no estate taxes, and no wealth taxes. And I thought that the group of people I was with was a pretty good representation of what the UAE is like. You know, some of the people that were at this party had wealth already when they moved here and then started enjoying this tax-free lifestyle once they got here. Other people built their wealth while they were here in the UAE and are enjoying the tax-free environment provided here to grow their wealth. And that's all fine and great when you're living here in the UAE, but what happens when you go home? Because a lot of people, a lot of the expats that live here do at some point return home. Now, hopefully that'll change with some of the laws that have been changing, like citizenship and long-term residency, but many people do move back home, or at least move to another country that has taxes at some point in the future. So while somebody is here, you can go to the next slide, Laura. So while somebody is in the UAE, their personal structure kind of looks like this, right? You have the expat, they have their investments in the UAE box. So as an example, they have their cash, they might be earning interest on it. They have their stocks where they're earning capital gains and dividends. They have their rental property income, and all that's being earned here in the UAE is not subject to income tax because it doesn't exist. Then they might also have some income from other countries, right? Maybe they own stocks in a European stock exchange or something like that. And those capital gains and dividends, while they're not taxed here in the UAE, there may be some withholding taxes in the country where this income was generated. And thanks to the UAE's expansive treaty network, a lot of times the withholding taxes on those dividends will be reduced when that income is being paid back to the UAE. And the same thing with country B, where you have the rental income. So this is kind of what the situation looks like when somebody's resident in the UAE. Go to the next slide, Laura. Okay, so what happens though when they go home? Lots of taxes, right? You're probably going to have income taxes. Some countries have estate taxes. Some countries have wealth taxes. And actually, wealth taxes is something that the OECD has been against for the good part of the last decade. But given what's happened with COVID and the massive stimulus that countries are passing, the OECD has now come out in favor of wealth taxes. So I think when you move to any country that has a tax system, you're not only going to be looking at the income taxes, but also the estate taxes and the wealth taxes. The solution to this is a Rack Icc Foundation. And next slide, please, Laura. So here's kind of what happens if somebody moves home without a Rack Icc Foundation, right? So now they've become a resident of country B in this case that has income taxes and estate taxes. So now all of the income that this person is generating within country B, so this could include salary. In this case, there's the rental property, there's the stocks with dividends and capital gains from country A, as well as all that income from the UAE, which isn't subject to tax in the UAE, is now being subjected to taxes in country B. And so 100% of this person's, 100% of the income being generated by this person's assets are now being taxed in country B. And worse yet, when this person passes away in country B and wants to leave their assets to their heirs, there's going to be an estate tax. And many countries have estate taxes in excess of 50%. And that's not going to get better anytime soon. So now I'm going to show what the solution of a Rack Icc Foundation looks like. Laura? So I'm just going to run through this quickly because Diana went through a lot of this. So the major tax benefits are by using the Rack Icc Foundation, and I'll show this when we get to the next graph. You're keeping all of your assets in the UAE being owned by this foundation. So you can shield them from income taxes, estate taxes, and wealth taxes. You can also accomplish your estate planning goals. So rather than actually wealth passing from one generation to the next, right? So instead of me dying and leaving the assets to my kids and then my kids leaving it to their kids and having that taxed on every generational transfer, you can have it in the foundation. And what winds up happening is you have the foundation here, and generation after generation just gets added as a qualified recipient. And so because the foundation will remain the owner of the assets and not the qualified recipients themselves, you avoid the estate taxes from generation to generation. The qualified recipients are also going to avoid the wealth taxes because they don't own the assets. The foundation owns the assets. So you can accomplish your estate planning goals. You can accomplish your succession planning goals. I mean, it's very important if you have a multi-generational structure. Not only are the qualified recipients going to change, but management is going to change. And you have to build in those processes into your foundation that you have an organized succession of management. Next slide, Laura. And then obviously asset protection, wealth protection, the assets owned by the foundation are not owned by the founder or the beneficiary. So if they're sued or, creditor tries to come after them for any reason, they're not going to be able to get those assets because they're owned by Rack Icc Foundation. And also, as Diana said, there's a private beneficial owner register in Rack Icc. It's not public. Okay, next slide, Laura. So this is what it would look like if a person were to place their assets into a Rack Icc Foundation before leaving the UAE and returning to their home country that has taxes. And as you can see, it looks a lot like the first diagram, right? Basically, rather than that individual continuing to own the assets themselves, they would found a foundation. They would contribute not only their assets in the UAE to that foundation, but they would contribute the assets in country A and country B to that foundation. That foundation is going to, assuming it's structured properly, is going to get the same benefit from the tax treaties that these individual did. So it's going to be able to get dividend and rental income from country A and B at a reduced rate. The income that's being earned in the UAE is going to be tax-free to the foundation rather than being taxed in country B, like it would be if the person moved home owning these assets. You can have a guardian, as Deanna explained, who kind of keeps an eye on the managing counsel to make sure they're not doing anything they shouldn't be, and the counselors would operate the foundation. And the expat and the expat heirs, as you can see here, living at home in country B, can receive distributions from the foundation.
So,
distributions would likely, it depends. Well, hold on. I think I just lost.
yes.
Hold on a second. I think I just lost. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but there is a bit of echo.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. I know what it's saying in country B, the expat as well as any other qualified recipients, which would usually include the heirs, can receive distributions from the foundation. Depending on the tax laws of the country, those distributions are most likely going to be subject to income taxes there. But that's better than having 100% of the income taxed. And instead of paying taxes on 100% of the income generated by your assets, you're only paying taxes on the portion that's distributed to you. And so the point is, I see so many people that don't give any thought to pre-exit planning from the UAE and just move home, continuing to own their assets when there is a better way. And that better way is to use a foundation. It can save a lot of money in taxes and income taxes, estate taxes, wealth taxes, and provide you all the other benefits that we've discussed: estate planning, succession planning, wealth protection, and privacy. And that's all I got.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I appreciate that that you and Diana have answered lots of questions, and I know that we, the time we've extended our 1 hour scheduled time, but I think because there are lots of people attending and interested to hear about foundations, and we've got lots of questions. We'll try to get answer as much questions as possible. Just a few questions I'd like to pick up. This one is for you, Alan. Can a Rack Icc Foundation own shares in Rack's free zone company directly?
Yes, they can. Simple answer. But speak to us about that, because we'll help liaise with Rack Icc over the documentation for you.
Some of you also asked about opening bank accounts for foundations, and they might be struggling with opening bank accounts. I will let Dr. Samir answer, but I just want to also add that we previously hosted one of the private banks in the DIFC who has incorporated lots of Rack Icc foundations or opened bank accounts for Rack Icc foundations, but I'll let Dr. Samir also interpret on this.
Very briefly, like with anything new, it takes time for the community, especially the bankers, to understand and absorb and adopt. So we know that foundations have been able to open bank accounts. We know that Rack Icc foundations have also been able to do it, but it's taking a little bit longer, and we can help you with which banks to go to make that process easier for you.
Okay, thank you. Need to understand more on charitable foundation to be set up with Rack Icc by the contribution of different people and institutions outside UAE. This is for you, Alan, probably, if you can.
Yeah, it would be best if I speak to that person individually. If they want to email into me, you could go into a dialogue. There isn't a simple answer to it, but we'd be happy to look at it with them.
Laura, actually a question that appeared many times, I noticed, is around real estate and Dubai real estate. So just to reiterate to everyone, Rack Icc has an MOU with the Dubai Land Department. You can register Dubai properties under Rack Icc, and we're also literally yesterday, yet to be announced, but I can tell you since it's official, we've also signed with the Land Department in Ras Al Khaimah. So anybody investing in a property in Ras Al Khaimah can also use the foundation to structure its ownership.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Samir. A question, I think, for Jimmy: wouldn't the IRS treat a foundation similar to a foreign trust and tax any income received from the foundation by the beneficiaries as disbursements or remuneration for council members if they are US citizens? Jimmy? Not sure if he's with us.
May have lost Jimmy because we're run out of time.
Okay, we'll ask Jimmy to respond to this question following the webinar. What is the situation with regard to the assets if, for example, the founder goes through a divorce? Maybe Diana can help us with this answer.
So the divorce will not necessarily impact the foundation in any way. So when we're talking about a foundation, we're talking about people who are sitting on this foundation as council members or beneficiaries. This is the kind of people that you will see in a foundation. Now, the relationship of a marriage, if it ends, I would advise clients always to have a prenup in place at all times, whether you have a foundation or whatever structure you are, when you are sharing wealth. A prenup is the only way to protect yourself, because the foundation has not necessarily will be to protect from a divorce, not at all. The will, however, will be immediately invalidated and will cease upon divorce, but not the foundation.
Diana, is it the key point there the ownership of the assets, the legal ownership? The husband doesn't own the assets, the wife doesn't own the assets, the foundation does.
Exactly. So there is nothing between them. However, a prenup is usually there for anything that is not a foundation. But the foundation itself will not be impacted, and whatever is in the foundation is and خلاص يعني it's a done deal.
Yeah.
You cannot really do much about it. But if you have assets away from the foundation, a prenup is always a necessary step before marriage. And that's I always say that to everyone.
Lara, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people now who probably have meetings or things prearranged. I just wanted to highlight something before we sign off. First of all, to thank Diana and Jimmy for the excellent presentation and really, really informative presentations. And I'm sure all our participants found that very, very useful. But I think a key thing I wanted to highlight is that although you saw there, you know, it's great that the UAE gives you the option to go the ADGM route, the DIFC route, or the Rack Icc route. But as the CEO of Rack Icc, I wanted to highlight three things. Diana was very clear on highlighting the confidentiality aspect of it, which is important. It's very, very, very important. And we feel that that is a big advantage. Secondly, I think there is a cost advantage going down the Rack Icc route. But thirdly, and I think more importantly than anything else, the portal, the ease of use of the portal and the accessibility of the Rack Icc team from a customer service perspective, and don't take my words for it, ask everybody else who's used Rack Icc, is the best, not just in the UAE, but I would say in the world. And we take pride in that. We really take pride in that because we are accessible. People can ask us a question 24/7 and we give them the information and help them get things done. And that makes a big, 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 big difference. I know people who've spent 3 months trying to put together a foundation and we're frustrated at every step of the way by requirements and details and asking the same thing 4 times and so on. Customer service is key and we pride ourselves in what we provide.
All right, thank you so much. We're gonna wrap up. I know there are lots of questions. We will answer them following the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you Diana and Jimmy for the comprehensive input and valuable input on foundations, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a lovely day everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Sure, thanks, bye.
Thanks, bye.